Welcome to URCA 360. Thanks so much for joining us here, where we talk about what's going on at the Utilities Regulation and Competition Authority. I'm Juan McCartney, the Corporate and Consumer Relations Manager here at URCA. And joining us today is the Director of Utilities and Energy, Mr. Jonathan Hudson. He's got a big responsibility. One of the things that URCA regulates throughout the country is energy, electricity, and it is a major challenge. One of the things that I find so interesting is that we have to become the regulator of so many different networks throughout the archipelago. And so it's not as if you're just regulating one solid network like, say, a New Providence or a Grand Bahama. You're regulating Abaco, you're regulating Bimini, you're regulating Andros. And so it's a major challenge. So explain to us some of the complexity involved in just trying to make sure that you have a grasp on what is actually going on.
Well, you're right in terms of the complexity. It sounds simple. There's one monopoly energy provider, that's BPL. So you would think you just have to regulate one entity. But the operating conditions are quite challenging in terms of the age of the networks, the age of the equipment, fuel deliveries, things like that. And the resources are limited. So part of what we do in our regulation is to take those types of things into account. So we are required to be reasonable in our actions. So it would be unreasonable to ask BPL to do things that they simply don't have the resources to do at this time. So you'll see one of the projects in the 2024 work plan that was started in 2023 was an audit of BPL's efficiency. So a measure of efficiency is getting greater output from the same input or reducing the input to get a similar output. So that's the efficient use of resources. So those are the kinds of things that we've had to focus on in these capital restrictive times.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So URCA started regulating energy in actuality in about 2017. And since 2017, particularly with regard to BPL, if we leave every other entity out of it, the smaller entities, we just had major challenges at BPL. So we've had outages, we've had equipment failures, we've had power surges, rolling blackouts, we've had escalating energy prices. So how does URCA wrap its arms around all of that to try to ensure that there's some stability going forward, as one of the remits of URCA is to make sure that there's affordable, reliable, stable, safe electricity?
Yeah, so you mentioned challenges earlier. I mean, that is some of the challenges that I elaborated on earlier. But how do we do that? Really, it's through planning. So both the Electricity Act and BPL's license requires forward planning. So for example, an integrated resource plan considers what the expected demand is for electricity going forward into the future. Say over a 5-year period, it considers the existing assets of BPL, and it looks at what is needed in terms of investment to meet that demand in the future. And if that is done properly, then you will, at a minimum, address the reliability aspect. These things aren't free, so it'll have some impact on cost. But in the forward planning aspect, you're trying to make sure you make the best use of a dollar. So then that's how you manage costs.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So people's dissatisfaction with BPL at certain points, URCA does take that seriously and does take it into consideration. And like you say, we're working with BPL, working with the government, since the government owns BPL, to ensure that there's some sort of sustainable plan for the future in place. Part of that would be renewable energy. The National Energy Policy has a particular requirement by a particular time. What's URCA doing to facilitate that move toward that 30% of renewable energy?
Okay. Before I answer that, I'll touch on the earlier answer, because you spoke about it a little further. one of the challenges of URCA as a regulator, we have to represent objectively and independently the interests of all stakeholders. So obviously that is consumers and customers. It's also the licensees like BPL and also the interests of the government. So it's a very balanced approach. There is the consumer protection aspect, but you have to balance that against the realities of the organization and the organization being BPL and the policy objectives of the government. So that's the balance we have to strike as a regulator. In terms of the development of the sector, like you rightfully said, one of the energy policy objectives and some of the earlier work, some of the initial work of URCA was to, in a sense, introduce some competition into the sector and give consumers the ability to choose and to align that with the policy objectives as spelled out in the National Energy Policy in terms of the penetration of renewables. So what URCA did in that regard was to develop a couple of renewable energy frameworks. The first being to facilitate residential customers to install renewable energy systems in their homes. The second was to expand that further to larger systems and to accommodate commercial and government entities. So now we have a regulatory framework for persons to put in place their own renewable energy from 0 kilowatts all the way up to 1 megawatt, which is 1,000 kilowatts. And realistically, that covers over 90% of persons who would want to do such projects. Some of the exceptions may be the larger entities like a hotel or a very large commercial building. But for the most part, anybody who wants to install a renewable energy system can do so. Further to that, and as part of that project, the nature of renewable energy is that it produces, at least solar energy, which is the predominant choice in the Bahamas, is that it produces energy when the sun is shining. So some of your peak production is in the middle of the day. Particularly on the consumer, on the residential consumer side, a lot of people aren't home during the middle of the day to utilize that energy. Now you can do things like have appliances that you can set the time when they come on, such as your washing machine or your oven or things like that. But in a lot of cases, that energy may be wasted from a financial point of view. So URCA allowed for a feed-in tariff, which means that any energy that you don't consume in your property that's being generated by your renewable energy system, you can send that back to the BPL grid and be paid for that energy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Excellent. So in further developing the energy sector, tell us some more about the work that URCA is planning for 2024.
Well, that's a lot. There's a lot planned for 2024.
Some.
We have 12 projects in total, which is an expansion on the projects we had last year, and we made an improvement in our productivity last year. Coming out of COVID had a bit of an impact on what we were able to achieve. Some of the projects include a review of the BPL fuel charge, a review of the renewable energy frameworks, and the review there of the renewable energy frameworks is to improve their use. Some of the other things are on the customer side to look at the current contracts between BPL and the customer to make sure they are fair to both parties. But the reality is when a small customer is dealing with a large organization such as BPL, there's an asymmetry in terms of the balance of power. And we wouldn't want BPL to be forcing conditions, terms and conditions onto the customer that aren't fair to the customer, simply because BPL can do so. It's one-stop shop. So we're reviewing those. The other thing is part of the Electricity Act requires the licensees, the authorized public electricity service providers in particular, to have in place a consumer protection plan. And the contents of that plan that the plan has to meet are set out in the Electricity Act. But it's things such as billing, consumer disputes, service reliability, service quality, things of that nature. Some of the larger projects are the completion of the study of BPL's operational efficiency that I mentioned earlier. We are doing a competition guidelines project. Previously, there were competition guidelines that were specific to the electronic communications sector. That's being expanded to the electricity sector. We should complete this year our account separation guidelines project. And there are a few other projects. There are 12 in total.
Right, yeah.
I'd encourage persons to look at URCA's annual plan to get a complete listing of those projects, and in there is a description of each one as well.
Right. I think one of the interesting things that I found here at URCA is that the energy sector is really developing a framework for what is and what could be in tandem, and I find that to be very interesting. So, for instance, we look at the generation license that was developed by URCA last year, and that really envisages perhaps more competition in the market, but it lays down the groundwork for if that's to come. Is that something you see that's possible, or do you plan for it just in any event?
That's a good point, and I'm glad you raised it, because there should be some clarity there. So the generation license is to facilitate entities that have a standby generating capacity in excess of 1 megawatt. So the Electricity Act, in Electricity Act, there's a general requirement that anybody who participates in any combination of generation, transmission, distribution, or supply requires a license. That's a very blanket statement. There are exceptions to that in the Act. The two primary ones being renewable energy projects that we discussed earlier, and the second is standby generation. In the Act, you are permitted to have standby generation for when the normal supply from the public electricity suppliers, such as BPL, isn't available, up to a capacity of 1 megawatt, which means that anybody who has a standby capacity in excess of 1 megawatt requires a license. Prior to last year, there was no provision for persons to comply with that requirement, so we established a generation license for persons to essentially not, or essentially to be in compliance with the Act. So that would be a large hotel, a large business, that should the BPL power go off, per se, their generators would kick in, start and supply their property. So it's really for standby generation.
Okay.
There was another license that was prepared prior to that called an independent power producer license. Those entities exist to provide power to the BPL grid. So they have generation capacity. It's not to supply themselves internally, it's to supply power to the grid. So they engage in a power purchase agreement contract with BPL to supply that power to the grid. So that's where the competition aspect, at least on the generation side, is facilitated in the Electricity Act and then empowered through the regulations that were put in place by establishing that type of license.
Excellent, excellent. So I'll just ask you finally, the mission at URCA is to improve lives through effective utilities regulation. How do you see the energy sector being more effective?
A number of different ways. Some of the largest challenges in the sector now, and these are very broad, deal with power quality, power reliability, and cost. They're very broad and very deep matters to deal with, particularly where we're starting from. So it goes back to what we first started out. How do we knowing where we need to get to, what is the most expeditious and efficient way to get there? And that is through proper planning and execution of those plans to achieve those goals.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Jonathan,
Very
for
welcome.
coming on URCA 360, and we hope to talk again soon.
Yes.